Dr. John Pazdziora, also a graduate of the Institute of Imagination, Theology, and the Arts at St. Andrews, thank you, Trevor, will be guiding us in a moment in a conversation on the prophetic seeing in George MacDonald's fiction. When John and I first met, after I had just finished my PhD, just finished defending my viva, and he was just beginning his PhD at the time, one of the things we talked about was about how not enough people had sufficiently considered George MacDonald's Scottishness. And 15 years on, I think that although better, not least for the book that John co-edited with Ginger Stell, Rethinking MacDonald, Context and Contemporaries, it's still too much the case. Perhaps this is in part because it's easy for many to forget that Scotland was, and Scotland is, a very different country from England.
Amen.
Different cultures, different histories, different art, different music, different educational history, different expressions of faith, even different languages. When MacDonald traveled down to London for the first time, I think this is really hard for us to even conceive of in the 21st century. When he traveled down to London for the first time, before traveling on a train was possible, the train only came up to Huntley when he was a young adult. It took him 3 days to get there. The European continent was much closer. There was much more commerce between the continent and Scotland than there was Scotland and London. Living in Scotland, as a few of us here have, or in Trevor's case, still does, Trevor still does, all three of them do, helps bring home that in new ways. Like once you live there, you really start to realize, it's kind of like when you move to Canada, you realize it's a different country from the States, and vice versa. They are different places. John is continuing to shift that aspect of MacDonald's scholarship. And I just heard recently online a great YouTube video with John discussing George Mackay Brown, who's another one of my favorite authors, and George MacDonald. And that's a great little, if you want a little introduction to some of the Scottishness of MacDonald. And John, did you know, did you know that they're related? I did matrilineal lineage, and they are actually related. George Mackay Brown and George MacDonald, which is through the mother's side, Mackay, Sutherland country, which is really cool. It makes sense, doesn't it? Because they actually have much resonance. Yeah, but a little exciting fact. But let's see, and I got myself totally lost in that little bit of excitement there. So John's continuing to shift that aspect of MacDonald's scholarship. Check out that video if you want to hear more about how he's doing that, whilst also looking at children's culture and the interplay of religion and literature in the 19th century. He is the author of Haunted Childhoods in George MacDonald and the co-editor, as we have heard, and hopefully we'll hear again, of the forthcoming Cambridge Companion to George MacDonald, co-edited with Danny. Hailing originally from Illinois and Wisconsin, John is also a husband and a father and a fiction writer. He has recently co-authored a picture book about Robert Louis Stevenson with Jane Yolen, and has also collaborated with his musician brother on some compositional works. I should add that if you want to natter about Harry Potter, John and Bob Trexler will be hard to beat between the two of them. John is the editor of the Ravenclaw Reader. But right now, rather than query John on an inheritor, I'd like to ask him that question about MacDonald himself that I asked Danny. How did he first discover MacDonald, and what's something about him or his work that drew you in deeper? So, coming up.
Thank you, Kirsten, for that lovely introduction. What first drew me into MacDonald, I think I'm fortunate in that I grew up with MacDonald. My parents, my father in particular, just had his books all around, had the Bethany House, Michael Phillips editions, had Glenn Sadler's fairy tale collections, just had his books around. And I just picked them up and read them because that was what I did most of the time, was just take books off the shelf and read them. And there's standing here giving a keynote address on George MacDonald, there's an interesting sort of temporal resonance, because I remember when I was in 5th grade, I gave a book report on At the Back of the North Wind, and there's a picture of me doing it, and I've got a poster behind me pointing to. I don't have a poster today, but anyway, so and it's always sort of been a presence in my whatever part of my mind this is over here. So.
That's really cool. And I don't know how I missed this, but John currently is a professor in Tokyo. And as you said earlier, he's the one who's traveled the furthest to be here today with us and teaches George MacDonald.
Yeah, I am actually teaching a class on MacDonald this semester, sort of in honor of the bicentenary.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Okay, John, please now help us better understand Prophetic Seeing in George MacDonald's section.
All right. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you so much to Kirsten, as I said, for that lovely introduction. Thank you also to Danny and Michael, who has a way of not being where I can point at him whenever I want to point at him. To Michael as well for all the effort they've put into organizing this event, these few days here. And thank you also to the Wade Center for hosting not only this conference, but so much excellent MacDonald scholarship, excellent MacDonald resources, which just each time I come to the Wade Center, there's more there, more treasures, more to discover. So thank you so much to the Wade Center as well for facilitating this event. I was talking about sort of weird temporal shifts. I was realizing that I don't get to the Wade Center as often as I should, and it's been 10 years next month since I was last here, interestingly enough. So I just want to begin talking today by acknowledging some elders of George MacDonald Studies who have passed on since I was last here at the Wade Center. Christopher Mitchell, Colin Manlove, Stephen Prickett, and Roland Hine. It was actually my tremendous good fortune to sit at various times and talk with each of these extraordinary teachers about George MacDonald. And I'm sure many of you also have memories and stories and conversations with each of them and all of them. And if it hadn't been for the work that they did on MacDonald, we wouldn't be here today having this conversation. We wouldn't be here in this way and in this form. So, now, let me read something to you from MacDonald's 1865 novel, Alec Forbes of Howglen, in which a prophetic movement, a fictitious prophetic movement, arises in northeast Scotland. A spirit of prophecy, whether from the Lord or not, was abroad this summer among the clergy of Glamerton, of all persuasions. Nor was its influence confined to Glamerton or the clergy. The neighborhood and the laity had their share. Those who read their Bibles, of whom there were many in that region, took to reading the prophecies, all the prophecies, and scarcely anything but the prophecies. Upon these every man, either for himself or following in the track of a spiritual instructor, exercised his individual powers of interpretation, whose fecundity did not altogether depend on the amount of historical knowledge. But whatever was known, whether about ancient Assyria or modern Tahiti, found its theoretic place. Of course, the Church of Rome had her due share of the application from all parties, but neither the Church of England, the Church of Scotland, nor either of the dissenting sects went without its portion freely dealt, each of the last finding something that applied to all the rest. Now this begins a prolonged subplot of clerical satire in which the various congregations of Glamerton bumble among conflicting prophetic signs and wonders, becoming frightened about events that never occur and misunderstanding events that do, and generally muddling their consciences. Such is their enthusiasm for prophetic rebuke, the narrator observes, quote, "One might have thought they were reveling in the idea of vengeance at hand, instead of striving for the rescue of their neighbors from the wrath to come," end quote. The fecundity of their interpretations of the prophetic books of Scripture arises from a skewed sense of their own importance. Quote, "To them, Glamerton was the center of creation, providence, and revelation. Every warning finger in the book pointed to it. Every burst of indignation from the laboring bosom of the holy prophet was addressed to its sinners," end quote. Even when the prophecies are demonstrably untrue, the enthusiasm for condemnation and doom-mongering continues. Quote, "The passion for prophecy," the narrator explains, "was a spiritual epidemic over the whole district." MacDonald, it seems, had little patience for self-styled prophets or so-called prophetic ministry. It is important to remember, too, as Kirsten actually sort of preambled this, that he wrote in the Scottish literary tradition of Robert Burns and Sir Walter Scott, whose works legitimized relentless, irreverent satire of the Kirk and her ministers. Consider, for instance, Burns' near libelous lampoon of Holy Wooly, or Scott's depiction of Reverend Kettle Drummle in The Tale of Old Mortality. MacDonald, writing as a trained minister, compounds this satirical tradition with professional insight, and MacDonald's bromides against the Kirk recall Walter Scott's shrewd, affectionate mocking of his own legal profession. When MacDonald addresses the prophetic calling of the church, he does so from a standpoint of ministerial care for the individuals whose spiritual progress it furthers or hinders. In his fiction, MacDonald portrays the prophetic imagination as imperfect, half-completed act of seeing through a glass darkly. It is characterized both by deep connection to the divine order of the cosmos and by determination to perceive past perception and see what is. For MacDonald, this means profound encounter with God as God's self, glimpsed at the bitter edges of human experience. So today I will first discuss the critique that MacDonald creates through the fictionalized prophetic movement at Glamerton, then consider some theological questions arising from his discussion of the prophetic imagination before examining MacDonald's intriguing motif of prophetically seeing the face of God. Now, I should say, by discussing prophetic seeing, I do not intend to privilege this sense or means of perception over any other. I'm using it as a form of metonymy. And also, I'm going to talk today pretty much exclusively about Alec Forbes of Howglen, but had I but whirled enough in time, I would just go through and talk about all of MacDonald's fiction, but I think some of you might want dinner later, so I'll get us out of here by midnight, I promise. Now, the first victim of the prophetic movement in Glamerton is Thomas Cran, the stonemason, one of MacDonald's most vivid and memorable characters. Thomas Cran is a member of the Free Church, or Missionar Kirk, as it was locally called, respected and feared as an elder and tradition bearer within Glamerton. Ponderous, irascible, with a builder's strength and asthmatic lungs, Thomas is roughly tender in his words and actions. Seen from the view of Annie Anderson, the protagonist of the novel, quote, Thomas was a rather dreadful man, with his cold eyes, high shoulders, and wheezing breath, end quote. He wears the blue bonnet of the Covenanters and prays daily, quote, upon his knees by the fireside with his plaid over his head. Thomas Cran does actually seem in some ways as a riposte to Walter Scott's characterization of the Covenanters in the Waverley novels. In particular, I'm thinking of John Balfour of Burley and Deuce Davy Deans. Thomas also seems to offer a counterbalance to the saintly title character of MacDonald's own David Elginbrod, presenting arguably a more measured depiction of a gruff, theologically astute Aberdeenshire labourer. Thomas is caught up in the prophetic fervour to his detriment. Quote, what the ministers spoke to the classes from the pulpit, Thomas, whose mode of teaching was insofar Socratic that he singled out his man, applied to the individual, end quote. Under the self-conscious weight of prophecy, Thomas proclaims that the town drunk is the town drunk, and that the village tart is the village tart, suggesting that their well-known vices will bring, quote, the wrath of the Almighty doon upon us like a spate, as it was in the days of Noah. But his rebuke serves only to encourage the town drunk to defend the virtue of the village tart, who happens to be his own daughter. Quote, Tom Cran, gin ye dare say another word against my Bobby with that foul mouth of yours, I'll worry you like a mad dog, ye ill-tongued scoundrel. Now this is, to put it mildly, not the hoped-for response to a call to repentance. The incoherent rebuke from the town drunk renders Thomas silenced and ashamed. And the next day he gruffly apologizes by sending him a pair of second-hand trousers several sizes too large. Now, despite the comedy inherent in this scene, MacDonald writes with a seriousness of purpose. Thomas has been caught up in the local self-importance of Glamerton and the enthusiasm for the vengeance at hand. He is not incorrect in pointing out the self-destructive behaviors of the individuals he names, nor is he wrong to suggest that their actions place a burden on the whole community. But despite his use of quasi-prophetic scriptural diction, he is speaking from his own observation and not through prophetic insight. Even in the flow of his rhetoric, he admits what he says is well kent. This sort of prophecy is no better than a parlor trick, sanctified table rapping, as it were, taking ordinary observation and declaiming it as though it were a revelation from God. The town drunk, to his credit, rejects it out of hand as the small-minded judgmentalism it is. Thomas Cran, to his credit, steps down from his bully pulpit and attempts, in his lumbering way, to make amends. Yet Thomas still clings to a sense of his prophetic burden. When the Kirk minister, Mr. Cowie, dies of old age, applied to the old age, Thomas ponders whether, quote, he's been ta'en awa frae the evil to come, frae seeing the terrible consequences of sic a saft way of dealing with eternal truth and with perishing men, ta'en away like Eli, when he brak his neck at the ill news. For the fire and brimstone that overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah is, I doot, hanging over this tune, ready to thaw and smoor us all. Now, this pretentious utterance prompts a retort from his housekeeper. Hoot, hoot! You never speak such awful words, Thomas. You're nae the prophet Johnny again. When Thomas protests, I tell ye the wrath of God mun be roused against this tune, for it's been growing war and war for many a year, till the very lasses are now to be lipping to them lanes alone. The housekeeper replies, what ken ye about the lasses, Thomas? Haud ye to the men. Thomas has sufficient knowledge of the biblical text and its rhetorical effects to sound the part of a prophet, and this sort of, in his dialogue, this free flow of scriptural allusion is, I think, another relation to Walter Scott in particular. Yet he is swayed too much by his own sensibility of the weight of his words, which earns him his housekeeper's rebuke. Beyond mere posturing, however, Thomas cultivates a deep practice of penitence and prayer, which holds him to awareness of the ground of his being in God. By accepting the rebukes he receives through the reality of his practice, Thomas finds a way past his ersatz prophecies to a deeper understanding of the relation of human to divine. As the prophetic movement continues, the hypocrisy and credulity of the people of Glamorton renders them prey to charlatans. A peddler sells cheap ballads masquerading as prophetic warnings of doom. A mentally disturbed individual wanders through the town shouting, "Yet 40 days and Glamorton shall be destroyed," speaking of the prophet Jonah. Most alarmingly, a placard is nailed to the door of every church in the town, quote, setting forth in large letters that, according to certain irrefragable calculations from the number of a man and other such of the more definite utterances of Daniel and St. John, the day of judgment must without fail fall upon next Sunday week. The placard causes some dismay, partly because of its mysterious origins and partly because its math seems correct. Thomas Cran, however, dismisses it out of hand, end quote. There's a heap of judgments between this and the higher end. The Lord will come when nobody's looking for him, and say we mun be aye ready. Ilka year is an anno domini. Every year is the Lord's year. Or to put it another way, all time is God's. Each moment contains eternity. There is no use calculating the hour of judgment because it is now and it is not now. It is here and it is not here. And so we mun be aye ready. This is a deep and complex truth which Thomas Cran sees and articulates by rejecting the theatricality of the self-anointed prophets. In fact, on the day foretold, the rivers around Glamorton flood in a spring storm, causing significant destruction of property and some loss of life. The flood, or spate in Scots, is one of the main set pieces of the novel. It would seem the dire prophecy has come to pass, but the narrator insists that the prophecy bears anything but good fruit. Quote, their appetite for prophecy having been assuaged with the assuaging flood, the people of Glamorton had no capacity for excitement left. Having once ceased to feel anxiety about some vague impending vengeance, comparatively few chose to be rated any longer about their sins, while some, seeing how in the spate the righteous were taken and the wicked left, felt themselves aggrieved and stayed at home on the Sunday nights. The direct result of the prophetic movement is increased apathy among the townsfolk regarding the condition of their souls and their devotion to God. The precise opposite, one assumes, of what a movement of the Spirit ought to achieve. All this suggests, as I said, that MacDonald had little patience for self-styled prophets and for the form of prophecy that consists in judgmentalism and elaborate faux mystic readings of the Hebrew Scriptures. This makes his own willingness to embrace the notion of a prophetic imagination all the more intriguing. And this then raises the question of what prophecy really is and how prophecy interacts with imagination. Now, this is both a theological and a literary question, and in attempting to answer it, I do not intend to directly address prophecy as it functions in the life of the church, or indeed the synagogue, the sangha, or elsewhere, but rather to ask how MacDonald portrays this function or engages with this function through his fiction. Now, perhaps the most influential study of prophecy in the past century is Rabbi Abraham Heschel's The Prophets. Heschel suggests that, quote, the fundamental experience of the prophet is a fellowship with the feelings of God, a sympathy with the divine pathos, a communion with the divine consciousness which comes about through the prophet's reflection of or participation in the divine pathos. This leads to what Heschel calls, quote, a breathless impatience with injustice, end quote, that is an intense concern with the plight of mankind. Heschel describes the prophet as a witness to God, the prophet's words revealing the divine presence. Quote, this is the marvel of the prophet's work. In his words, the invisible God becomes audible. Now, while Heschel is probably right, applying this to MacDonald's fiction is less straightforward. Certainly, rendering the invisible God audible can be said to be one of MacDonald's artistic concerns, but ascribing this work to the imagination seems presumptuous at best and idolatrous at worst, putting glib words in the mouth of an imaginary deity, as the prophets of Glamerton did. Nor does MacDonald appear to have developed a sophisticated theology of prophecy, or felt any inclination to do so. Generally, he uses prophecy in its colloquial sense of foretelling the future, with a notable exception appearing in Salted with Fire, his last novel published in 1897, in a description of a Sunday school lesson on St. John's Gospel, when the teacher specifically contrasts prophesy with foretell and shows the congregation the difference between the meaning of the Greek word and that of the modern English word prophecy. Now, MacDonald does not elaborate, and the texts which the Sunday school lesson is notionally on do not actually mention prophecy, but he is presumably referring to the Greek word propheteo, which Liddell Scott, and it's almost certainly the lexicon he used, glosses as to be an interpreter for the gods, to interpret and expound the will of a god like an oracle or soothsayer. This emphasizes both the need for the prophet to correctly understand what the gods wish to communicate and the inscrutability of the divine message to most people. Now, Salted with Fire is a late work, and so sheds only dim light on MacDonald's writings of 30 years prior, yet this insight, the juxtaposition there of insight with close observation, echoes his discussion of the physical sciences in his essay, The Imagination, Its Functions, and Its Culture, which Danny didn't close read for us, but gave us the skeleton of earlier today. Now, MacDonald uses the phrase prophetic imagination to describe specifically how a scientist designs experiments. MacDonald distinguishes between observing empirical data and apprehending the larger physical laws which govern the experimental outcome. Addressing an imagined Gradgrindian interlocutor, he declares, quote, we yield you your facts, the laws we claim for the prophetic imagination. And then a bit further down, quote, it is the far-seeing imagination which beholds what might be a form of things, and says to the intellect, try whether that may not be the form of these things. Now, that's actually, I think, a rather beautiful description of the scientific method. Okay. The imagination can sometimes be right, because MacDonald says it is on some deep level connected to these underlying laws. Quote, we dare to claim for the true, childlike, humble imagination such an inward oneness with the laws of the universe that it possesses in itself an insight into the very nature of things. End quote. Now, and I do think he echoes this idea elsewhere in Salted with Fire, but this sentence contains two important clarifications for understanding the place of prophecy in MacDonald's concept of the imagination. First, it closes off the utility, and I suggest the possibility, of prophetic imagination as a category noun. For MacDonald, there is not a prophetic imagination siloed off from other forms of imagination, sacramental imagination, poetic imagination, magical imagination, and so on. Rather, being prophetic is one of several interrelated functions of the imagination as a generative unity, imagination singular, but operating in various ways. MacDonald seems to use the phrase in dynamic tension, akin to Walter Brueggemann's observation that, quote, the juxtaposition of the two terms, prophetic and imagination, redefines each of them. Brueggemann suggests that, quote, the word pair, prophetic imagination, identifies an elusive, daring, subversive verbal probe in ancient Israel that intended to subvert the settled political, economic order of royal Jerusalem. He writes, quote, to qualify prophetic by imagination is to dig deeper than moral earnestness into the notion of playful, venturesome probing into the unknown that requires poetic utterance and evokes daring images and metaphors, all in the service of an elusiveness out beyond royal totalism. On the other hand, to qualify the term imagination by the adjective prophetic delivers imagination from sheer fantasy into a world of covenantal engagement that features God as the compelling partner of both the human prophetic utterer and those who hear the prophetic utterance in serious ways. End quote. Now, Brueggemann is writing in the context of Christian scholarship on the Hebrew Scriptures, but he does gesture towards the study of literature, with poetic utterance being required by the playful, venturesome probing into the unknown, although this relationship is more fraught than he seems to assume. Here, the second clarification of MacDonald's claims for the true, childlike, humble imagination becomes crucial. For MacDonald, imagination has to do with substantially more than sheer fantasy, by which I understand Brueggemann to mean airy fairy daydreams, castles in the air, and so on. He's not using this in a positive sense. MacDonald relates imagination, quote, to an inward oneness with the laws of the universe. His own playful, juxtaposition of prophetic and imagination thus indicates insight into the very nature of things. The playful use of the two words is itself a form of insight. The prophetic function of the imagination is thus to embody this insight, to bear witness to what is. Its expression constitutes what Heschel calls authentic utterance, derived, quote, from a moment of identification between a person and a word. Significantly, Heschel distinguishes between prophetic and literary expression, arguing that language is inadequate to the prophet's task. Quote, the thoughts he has to convey is more than language can contain. Thus, typifying prophetic speech is a fool's errand. Quote, the prophetic utterance has no finality. It does not set forth comprehensive law, but a single perspective. It is expressed ad hoc, often ad hominem, and must not be generalized. Now, Heschel strikes an important note of caution. The prophets reveal a presence beyond the reach of words. They convey their message not through, but in spite of language and the burden of utterance. Use of language, literature, poetic speech, perhaps or even especially theological speech, is inadequate to the task of rendering God audible. Brueggemann is more optimistic, arguing that the poetic cadences of the prophets serve to evoke, to shock, to tease, to play, to probe, not with certitude, but with possibility for what has been until now unthinkable and unsayable. Brueggemann seems quietly confident that, quote, imagination grounded in narrative imagination that attests to God will reveal vistas of possibility through the efficacy of this prophetic utterance. But pressing out to the very boundaries of language, as poets must do, attempting to formulate the unthinkable and articulate the unsayable, necessarily leads not to clarity, but to breakdown of meaning. So Heather Walton, reflecting on the relation between poetics and theology, describes, quote, the theological joy and terror that are provoked by poetic encounter, writing, quote, excuse me, quote, I am haunted by the sense that what is really important to say is challenging me from beyond the limits of my speech. Walton cites research into the narratives of Holocaust survivors and victims of abuse, whose experiences, quote, can only be told partially, elliptically, and in a way that renders the world strange, both for the hearer and the teller of the story. Such speech, Walton says, challenging us from beyond the jagged edge of what humanity can endure, quote, opens up a terrifying revelation, the eruption of an unmanageable transcendence that is like a coal that burns in our mouths with fire until even we who can't speak will speak. End quote. The prophetic function of the imagination attempts to grapple with this unmanageable transcendence, recognizing the partial elliptical nature of presence and acknowledging a presence which is absence. Prophetic speech dares to make audible the silence of God. Yet words cannot describe silence. The presence of a prophet and the wordiness of a text, both in their separate ways, belie the deep experience of silence and absence in which authentic utterance is rooted. Now, MacDonald was deeply aware of this heresy of paraphrase, and attempted, not wholly convincingly, but honestly, to resolve it. So, in The Imagination, Its Functions and Its Culture, after MacDonald claims the law of the universe for the prophetic imagination, he immediately provides a scriptural proof, quoting the first part of Ecclesiastes 3:1. He hath set the world in man's heart, adding, not in his understanding. This passage is significant enough for his argument that he quotes it in full at the end of the essay, as Danny quoted earlier, and I will now quote it again to remind everyone. I have seen the travail which God has given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. He had made everything beautiful in his time. Also he hath set the world in their heart, so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from beginning to end. Now, there's a small but important discrepancy in these quotations. In the first one, he says, he set the world in their, the first one, MacDonald says, he hath set the world in their hearts, which is the text as the authorized version gives it. Earlier, however, the second one is in their hearts. The previous one is the world in man's hearts, and that's not the authorized version, that's the text as Francis Bacon quotes it in The Advancement of Learning. So Francis Bacon uses this passage from Ecclesiastes to argue that the unknowability of God's work is strictly in the physical realm. And Bacon writes that God hath framed the mind of man as a mirror or glass capable of the image of the universal world, and joyful to receive the impression thereof, as the eye joyeth to receive light. And so he sees Ecclesiastes as describing physical limitations. We can't find out God's work because we are physically bound in a body and we live in a society and all this sort of thing. MacDonald seems less certain and less willing to commit to the mind-body dualism that Bacon is doubling down on here. He declares that Ecclesiastes, quote, is setting forth both the necessity we are under to imagine and the comfort that our imagining cannot outstrip God's making. MacDonald again quotes from The Advancement of Learning to describe imagination as being playfellows with God in this game of making, concealing, and discovering, as Danny told us so ably just a few minutes ago. For MacDonald, not being able to find out that the work that God maketh from beginning to end means no one can find out the whole of it, but finding out portions of it is possible. MacDonald attempts to make unmanageable transcendence manageable through radical immanence, what Sally McFague has called, quote, the model of the world, universe as God's body, writing, quote, the body of God encompasses all creation in a particular salvific direction toward liberation, healing, and fulfillment of all bodies. McFague argues that just as every flower or insect is the body of God, if we choose to see it as such, so also every creaturely body in need is Christ's body, if we can see it as such, end quote. And now this sight depends on close observation of the material world. To again quote McFague, suddenly to see some aspect of creation naked, as it were, in its elemental beauty, its there-ness and its suchness, stripped of all conventional categories and names and uses, is an experience of transcendence and immanence, inextricably joined. This possibility is before us in each and every piece and part of creation. It is the wonder at the world that young children have and artists retain. This, I think, is much how MacDonald reads Bacon's image of being playfellows with God. So, MacDonald writes, the little ones may gather their daisies and follow their painted moths. The child of the kingdom may pour upon the lilies of the field and gather faith as the birds of the air, their food from the leafless hawthorn, ruddy with the stores God has laid up upon them. By attentively observing any object, and by simply doing the next right thing, the individual discovers the work that God maketh within that thing. This is an act of self-discovery. The world is in their heart. The divine order seen in the daisy is fully present within the individual. This is also, to use McFague's words, quote, a sense of radical interrelatedness and interdependence with all that exists, the acceptance of responsibility for other forms of life and the ecosystem. End quote. Excuse me. The whole of God's self and the entirety of the divine order is present in any particular object and revealed by doing the next right thing. This view is the keystone of MacDonald's ethic and crucial for an understanding of his work. Now, in this sense, Thomas Crann can be read as embodying MacDonald's juxtaposition of prophetic with imagination. Intellectually, Thomas is committed to a form of Calvinist free church theology, which MacDonald found deeply distasteful, if not outright heterodox. At a deeper level, however, the world is in Thomas Crann's heart, and he accepts profound responsibility for other forms of life. As I noted, Thomas's faith is sustained through a daily practice of mortification and prayer, sitting wrapped under his plaid as he prays for God's mercy. Quote, "The devotions of the day were not to be concluded for him with any social act of worship. He had many anxious prayers yet to offer before his heart would be quiet in sleep. Especially there was Alec to be prayed for, and his daughter Annie, and in truth the whole town of Glamerton, and the surrounding parishes, and Scotland, and the world. Indeed, sometimes Thomas went further, and although it is not reported of him that he ever prayed for the devil as that worthiest of Scotch clergymen prayed, yet he did something very like it once or twice, when he prayed for the hale universe of God, and all the beings in it, up and down, that we ken unco little about." Once again, Thomas's spiritual understanding outpaces the narrowness of his theology. While he sincerely believes that only a few elect will be saved from damnation, he cannot help but praying that the whole universe of God will be part of that elect. As the narrator remarks elsewhere, his common sense was running away with his theology. Thomas's daily practice, simply doing the next right thing he sees that he should do, has led him to a deeper sympathy with the divine nature than he can admit to himself that he possesses. Now, this sympathy guides him into a genuinely prophetic act of seeing. Early in the novel, Annie Anderson, while still a schoolgirl, visits the Missionar Kirk, and the douce words of the preacher seize her with fear that she is not one of God's elect, but is irrevocably damned to hell. Her nervous interactions with the stonemason before have convinced her, quote, that Thomas was possessed of some divine secret, and so she visits him with her anxiety, asking, "Who's a body to ken whether she be ane of the elect?" This is a profound question, and has been seriously dealt with by Calvinist theologians. Thomas, of course, has his own views on the subject. Quote, "Weel, lassie," answered Thomas, with solemn conviction in every tone, "it's my firm belief that, say what they like, there is and there can be but one way of coming to the knowledge of that secret. Get a sight of the face of God. It's my belief, and all the ministers in creation will no gar me alter my mind, that no man can get a glimpse of the face of God but ane of the chosen. Try ye to get a sight of the face of God, lassie. Syne you'll ken, and be at peace." To help Annie understand this concept, Thomas tells her the story of his own experience of doubting his salvation and grappling with God in prayer, and the passage is worth quoting at some length. "When it pleased the Lord to call me, I was standing in my lane in the midst of a peat moss, looking west, where the sun had left a reed licht behind him, as Ginny had just brunt out of the lift and hadna gone down a va. And it minded me of the day of judgment. And there I stayed and looked till the light itself died out, and naething was left but a grey sky and a few sterns in it. And the clouds gathered, and the lift grew black and murk, and the hale countryside vanished, till I kent no more about it than what my 2 feet could answer for. And I darna move for the fear of the pits of water and the Walleen, Willies, Quagmire Springs, on Ilkahan." Thomas, remember, is a stonemason. His life and livelihood deal with the shaping and placing of solid rock. There is a deep dramatic significance to his night of spiritual agony taking place in a peat moss among quagmires and unseen pits of water. He is adrift from the certainties of his life and farther out into spiritual anguish than his beliefs can carry him. "The lee lang licht I stood, or lay, or kneeled upon my knees, crying to the Lord for grace. I forgot about election, and cried just as again I could, God him hear me by holding at him. And in the morning, when the licht came, I found that my face was to the rising sun, completely turned around without realizing it. Thomas has come unmoored from his sense of place and from his structures of belief, even from his embodied self. Sickened by his night on the moor, he creeps homeward, and ilka body at I met o' the road took to the tither side of it and glared at me as gin I had been a ghaist or warlock.
He is ill in bed for 3 days without eating. And on the 4th day, in the afternoon, I gaed to my work with my head swimming and my heart like to break for very gladness. I was ane of the chosen. Crucially, MacDonald does not tell us what Thomas saw or how he realized the truth of his salvation. Thomas's own explanation to Annie is simply that she will know it when she sees it, if she sees it. The implication of the 3-day illness, perhaps, is that Thomas has bodily experienced the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, and someone like Julian of Norwich saw the face of Christ in his own physical suffering. Whatever the case, the perception came through an experience of struggle and precarity, teetering on the borders between life and death, and there encountering an eruption of unmanageable transcendence. Certainly, Annie's own subsequent experience takes place in similar circumstances. Alec Forbes, with whom Annie has been in love for most of the book, returns home from university in Aberdeen, desperately sick with pleurisy and racked with bereavement, a sense of guilt, and a broken heart. His health collapses, and his recovery is painful and slow. His mother and Annie take care of him, along with his close friend, Mr. Cupples, the university librarian, who comes to Glamorton to help Alec during his convalescence. It is through the extremity of Alec's illness that Annie has her own sight of God's face. Quote, "At length, one lovely morning, when the green corn lay soaking in the yellow sunlight, and the sky rose above the earth, deep and pure and tender like the thought of God about it, Alec suddenly became aware that life was good, and the world beautiful. He tried to raise himself but failed. Couples propped him up with pillows and opened the window that the warm waves of air might break into the cave where he had lain so long, deaf to its noises and insensible to its influences. Alec's mother entered. She saw the beauty upon her boy's worn countenance. She saw the noble watching love on that of his friend. And her own filled with light, and she stood transfixed and silent. Annie entered, gazed for a moment, fled to her own room, and burst into adoring tears. For she had seen the face of God, and that face was love. Love like the human, only deeper, deeper, tenderer, lovelier, stronger. She could not recall what she had seen or how she had known it, but the conviction remained that she had seen his face and that it was infinitely beautiful. The narrator both tells and does not tell us what Annie sees. The inciting tableau is described in some detail. The older man tenderly caring for the younger, the mother's face filled with light, in language that evokes Plato's allegory of the cave, suggesting a deeper awakening in Alec than the physical. But the narrator is emphatic that Annie herself could not recall what she had seen. As with Thomas Cran, it leaves an indelible impression without any specific image. Pondering the experience afterwards, Annie says, "God's just anything but God himself." Annie has grasped a profound tautology, an elaboration and extension of Thomas's declaration that Ilke years and Anno Domini. The idea that God is present in and arriving through every moment is broadened here to recognize that God is nothing but God. The tableau of love which Annie saw has led her to a vision of God out with time, God existing solely in relation to God. It remains for Alec Forbes himself, bluff, athletic, good-hearted Alex, to attempt to describe God's face. Near the end of his university studies, Alec travels as a ship's surgeon on an Arctic expedition. The voyage ends in disaster. The ship is trapped in ice, and as Alec tells Annie afterwards, "I found myself am alone in the dreadful place, in the very beauty of which was deadly." And that is perhaps an echo of the first line of Dante's Inferno in that line. Alec continues, "Annie, I think what Thomas Cran used to say mun be true. Annie, I think a body may someday get a kind of sight of the face of God. I was sae downcast when I saw myself lit ahine that I sat down upon a rock and glowered at nothing. It was awful, and it grew waur and waur. The only comfort I had was that I couldna live long. And with that the thought of God came into my head, and it seemed as if I had a right, as it were, to call upon him. I was sae miserable." and there came over me a quietness, like a warm breath of spring air. I didn't ken what it was, but it set me upon my feet. The silence at first had been fearful, but now, somehow or other, I cannot rightly explain it. The silence seemed to be God himself all about me. Now this contains the same elements as Thomas and Annie's experiences: an extremity of anxious emotion, a near-death physical illness, and an overwhelming awareness of something that cannot be described. To this, Alec adds glowering at nothing and a quietness. The silence seemed to be God himself. Surrounded by nothing and dying from it, Alec recognizes the presence that is absence. Out of nothing, nothing speaks. God speaks nothing, and so the silence becomes God's voice. This is, and I think quite deliberately, an echo of the prophet Elijah's encounter with God on Mount Horeb, when God is not in the fierce majesty of storm and fire, but in smallness and stillness. So, comparing these three sights of of God's face, something like a portrait begins to appear. Thomas Cran sees God in the particularity of time and of the body, specifically an isolated and ill body, specifically his own body. Annie sees God in loving relationship, specifically the tableau of a chosen family gathered together in a sick room. Alec sees God in nothing and in silence, specifically in his own approaching death. God is all of these and none of these, presence and absence, word and silence together, breaking into awareness at moments of physical precarity that render the world strange. None of them can describe what they saw. Thank you.
Beautiful, and the irony is I'm sitting here not knowing how to sum up. I feel like I need time to process and sit with some of that. I think one of my favorite phrases from you was the noticing, and I think this happens throughout MacDonald's work in many places, that the spirituality outpaces the narrowness of his theology. That is so, it permeates so many of his texts, which is such a wonderful thing for us to be able to receive as readers and sit in that. And thank you for the beauty and for the silence that you gave us, a place to sit in. We have a little bit of time for some questions, and maybe some of you are better at pulling together a deeper question for John than I am at the moment. But a recollection that for John and Danny and all the others, this is part of what our coffee time is for, our dinner times. Tomorrow we'll have some more spare times. Please keep asking these people questions and keep on discussing the talks amongst yourselves too. Does anybody have, and I'm going to do better thanks, Joe, at looking this direction. Sorry guys, as well as this direction this time. Mark.
What do you think about Joseph Polworth as maybe a positive type of prophet?
Oh yes, I think absolutely. I mean, that was when I was thinking. Well, I sort of committed to this topic, and I was writing it. And I realized, the other way you could get into this topic of prophetic seeing is go into MacDonald's fiction and looking at characters like Polworth who are living with disability, or an Alec Forbes. Yes, Joseph Polworth from Thomas Wingfold, or an Alec Forbes of Howglen, Tibby Deister, who's born without sight. And you do find these characters persistently through his work who do have that prophetic connection, who are able to speak actually in the sense he defines in Salted with Fire, the Greek sense of interpreting the will of God, seeing and perceiving someone. Almost invariably, I want to say invariably, but I need to double check this. They're living with disability of one kind or another, mental disability, physical disability. So he puts these two things together in a very, I think, provocative and perhaps I should say prophetic way. So I would agree with that wholeheartedly, yes.
Just a quick tackle on Sir Gibby is called a prophet, and he can't speak.
Yes.
And Rob of the Angels.
Yes.
What's my slide? Okay, I'm gonna back up so I can see people all around. Holy.
Would you connect second sight as sort of different than the religious prophetic? Would you, and often second sight in Scottish. I was born in Scotland. Anyway. We associate it with people with disabilities often.
Yes, I would specifically. Actually, there was an entire third section to the paper where I talk about the portent and say, okay, MacDonald goes into the pre-Christian tradition of the second sight to interrogate the nature of prophecy, and then I realized people want to eat before 10. So but yes, I think for him it's very much on a continuum in terms of how he's thinking about it, and what he does with the idea of prophecy and the portent is very, very interesting. And I won't explain more because I won't stop. But thank you.
Back there and then Dan again.
Thank you very much. So we see, you said, this portrait that emerges of isolation, sickness, service, suffering, disability, the face of God, right? Wouldn't that sort of push us towards saying that the face of God is the face of Christ crucified, God for us? That's MacDonald's picture of how you know you're elect is by understanding the nature of who Christ is and what he's done. Is that kind of what we're aiming for?
To some extent, I want to say yes. I hesitate to say yes wholeheartedly because MacDonald himself says something directly like that, and very often when he says something directly, he then turns around and dismantles it somewhere else indirectly. But there's a wonderful sonnet of his which you haven't read, where he basically he describes Moses on a rock stood lone in space, from Sinai's top the thunderous vapors place, God passed in clouds, an earthly garment worn to hide and thus revealed. He is describing Moses in the cleft of the rock. And he says, Ah, Moses, had he turned, and hadst thou seen the pale face crowned with thorns, bedecked with tears, the eyes of the true men by men belied, thou hadst beheld God's face, and straightway died. So it's this wonderful image of God turning around to see Moses and being that broken face. And the only reason I would hesitate to say yes is it's not that in these people we see through these people to Christ's face, but that Christ's face, I think for MacDonald, Christ's face is living with disability, is living with pain. Sort of St. Teresa of Avila, Christ has no body now but yours. So I think there's something going on there in that we're not just Christ is revealed in and not through, if that makes sense. So qualified, yes, I think so.
Thank you, John. You've delivered on the gravitas, but I would also say excellent on the levity as well with your readings and everything. I suppose, and as the one I wanted to bring in, disability. But another thing that you're an expert on, and I'll give a shameless plug for John's book, which on haunted childhood, which is also on special discount offer for the conference.
It is 30% off. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
But what about death? And I think bringing in the imagination and function in this culture. He says about Shakespeare. Shakespeare often has his characters on the brink of death. That's the prophetic. Yes. That's the prophetic moment. I just wondered, as an expert on MacDonald and death, if you might comment a little bit on that.
It's very interesting because again, with all of these, less with Annie because Annie's sort of seeing it in the love around the moment of healing. But Thomas Cran is definitely ill. Alec Forbes is definitely ill. You find that over and over again, and where you find that most interesting, we're going back to the portent here, is at the beginning of The Shadows, with Ralph Rinkelmann is elected the king of the fairies, and they can't get at him because the fairies can get mortals when the moment of birth, they can get them at the moment of death. It's the only time when and Ralph Rinkelmann becomes very, very ill, and the fairies grab him when he's in that state of precariousness. So there's something about, and that's going back to Scottish folk tradition, Scottish fairy belief. That's going all the way. You'll find this in medieval texts like Sir O'Feo, that it's that moment between birth, as you're dying, the fairies can steal your soul. And that's the moment where MacDonald says, okay, here's the prophetic revelation of God's face, which is also the moment when the fairies can steal you away. So something very interesting is going on there. But I think, yes, you do find a somewhat different, I suppose a somewhat different witness, or he's seen in a different way. And I think, again, if I had time, I could add the testimony of Tibi Deister, the woman who is visually impaired in Alec Forbes, who does die in the flood. She's one of the righteous carried away. And that sense of when Annie and Thomas Cranmer are talking about it later, that now she can see God. Now she's getting her sight restored. Now, that is as may be, but there's that sense of that death also can have that thing. Confronting death also can have that thing. But also, I think in writing about death, well, the other thing I talk about this in my book, which is over there, 30%. When Diamond dies at the back of the North Wind, how MacDonald pushes against the sentimentalization of death. He pushes against that sentimentalization of that scene, and really does kind of leave, death is the country from whose bourne no traveler returns. We don't know what they see. We don't know what they're experiencing. We can hope, but he does sort of root it more in I think it's something like Alec Forbes. He's dealing with his own experiences of illness as well. So, yes, I think. Thank you.
I'm just nervous up for the side. Okay, well maybe we'll hold that. We'll hold the space for a while. And one of the things we're going to do at dinner, and I feel like I've got a whole new bag to set up at dinner, but John, I will let you sit down so you'll have to hear me talk about dinner. Thank you so much again. Thank you.